All right, hello and welcome to our very first video lecture in Introduction to Law. What we're going to be talking about today is tied in with what we were talking about the last few days, which was human rights. Now, you see many of those human rights that we were talking about in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights being reflected in our very own Constitution. So, what is our Constitution? Our Constitution in this country, we actually have the oldest Constitution in the entire world. Our Constitution, you can think of it like a rule book. Okay, if you were to, not that anybody's playing board games anymore, if you were to play a board game, let's say Monopoly, you dust it off because I'm sure it's in the bottom of your closet somewhere. You pull it out, and the very first thing that you're going to have to do is you're probably going to have to remind yourself how to play the game. So you're going to have to read the rules. And that's what the Constitution is for our country. It is the rule book for our country. Not only does it grant you and I our rights and liberties that we enjoy every single day, but on top of it, it also outlines exactly how our government's supposed to function. And more importantly, it places limits on our government. We're going to cover three things here. The Declaration of Independence, which actually is not even part of the U.S. Constitution. It's a separate document altogether, but I'll get to that in a moment. Constitutional principles, that we're going to spend the bulk of this lecture focused on constitutional principles and also the outline of the Constitution. I'm going to want to show you an outline of the U.S. Constitution so you know exactly what this document is supposed to look like. Oftentimes I find that students, when they think of the Constitution, they think that this rule book is pages and pages and pages. It would be a thick book, but really it's not. It's 7 articles, and then you have 27 amendments or changes to the Constitution, but the document itself is not all that long and would not take you all that long to read either. So let's jump into it. So the Declaration of Independence, if it's not part of the U.S. Constitution, why are we talking about it? Well, the reason why we're talking about it is because on the Constitution test that you're actually going to need to take in order to graduate high school, you have to take and pass the U.S. Constitution test. It is an Illinois state requirement. They do cover the Declaration of Independence as well. So the Declaration of Independence was ratified on July 4th, 1776. The Constitution, on the other hand, was ratified in 1788. So we have a gap here. The Declaration of Independence, if this is the document that had declared our independence from Great Britain, and yet we didn't have a rule book, or at least our current rule book, until 1788, went into effect in 1789, there's a gap there. So what had governed this country between the moment that we split from Great Britain to the point that we had our current rule book? Well, that's the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles of Confederation was the initial rule book of this country. I'll get to the Articles of Confederation in just a moment. But I first want to talk about the structure of the Declaration of Independence. So when we're talking about the Declaration, there's 3 distinct parts, and you can think of it like a breakup letter. My girlfriend's friend recently broke up with her boyfriend, and she didn't send him a breakup text or anything, but if she were to send up a breakup text or send him a breakup text, she might have worded it like this. She would start out with a philosophic beginning. She may talk about what love is and what love is not, that love is a joining of 2 souls, that love is when 2 people support each other and they're there for each other through thick and thin. And these are all her philosophic ideas about what love is supposed to be. Well, our Declaration of Independence starts out with a philosophic beginning. We talk about what a country is supposed to be. We talk about how a country, how a government is supposed to treat its people. And then it moves into the long list of grievances against King George III. If in Kari, that's her name, if Kari were to write this breakup text, the middle section of this breakup text may read off a list of specific grievances against her boyfriend or ex-boyfriend. She may say, well, you didn't come to my rehearsal. You didn't support me when I was upset over having a bad day at work. You didn't do this. You did do that. And so she would read off a list of specific grievances. And that's what you find in the middle portion of the Declaration of Independence. You have a long laundry list of grievances against King George III, who was the King of England from 1760 to 1820. And then finally, you have the actual declaring of American independence from Great Britain. This would be the conclusion of Kari's breakup text. She would end it by actually breaking things off. So she would start out with, this is what love is, and then move to the long list of specific grievances or specific problems in the relationship, and then she would conclude it with, we're done. You and I are no longer. And that's what the Declaration of Independence is. It's a breakup letter. We have the principles why we're leaving Great Britain, the specific reasons why we're leaving Great Britain, and then, no, seriously, we're leaving you. And then we broke things off and we became our own country in 1776. So, what is in the Declaration of Independence? Let's talk about a couple ideas that can be found in the Declaration. The very first is this idea that all men are created equal, that no American is in a position of superiority over anybody else. Now, of course, as you will surely learn in U.S. history, the story of American history is a story of gradual progress towards this ideal. When this was first written, all men did not mean every American. All men meant white property owning males. And as time goes by, more and more people were included into what was considered to be men in the Declaration of Independence. And now, the way that the Declaration is interpreted, this promise should be that all Americans are created equal. The second big principle or idea behind the Constitution was that the government gets its power from the consent of the governed. So the government no longer gets its power from a king. Our leaders are in power because we, as the people, have granted them the permission to lead us. In our democracy, we grant them this permission by voting. And that leads me to this next point. Revolutions are appropriate when governments are bad. Now, in the United States, we don't currently have these violent revolutions or anything like that. Our revolutions, think of a political revolution, our revolutions manifest themselves in the form of people voting out leaders that we disapprove of and then voting in leaders that maybe are from a different political party or have a different political belief system. That would be a form of a democratic revolution. The last big principle that I wanted to talk about was that men have rights that the government cannot take away. The Declaration of Independence refers to inalienable rights, and these are rights that all human beings are born with. In our Declaration of Independence, it is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Moving on. So, BC, I dropped the term earlier, the Articles of Confederation, and you've probably heard of that, maybe in 8th grade U.S. history. You talked about the Articles of Confederation. Well, this was our original rule book in this country. The issue is that it didn't work all that well. There were many problems with it, but the greatest weakness of the Articles of Confederation was that it did not allow for a strong central government, meaning that the state governments were too strong, the federal government was not strong enough. So essentially, it was like the kids ran the house, or the students ran the school. There was too much power that was given to the individual states, and when when the federal government needed to exercise power, they did not have the ability to do so. So you had the founding fathers did the equivalent of just crumpling up that original rule book, throwing it in the trash, and then reassessing. They traveled to Philadelphia in order to draft a new and our current U.S. Constitution. So let's move to the actual U.S. Constitution. So now we're beyond the Declaration of Independence. So what I wanted to spend the next couple slides talking about are the principles in the Constitution. The principles meaning the big ideas that can be found in the Constitution. So we're not going into the specifics. What we are just talking about are the big ideas. So the first big idea that goes behind the Constitution is this idea of federalism. So federalism is this division of power between the central government, so the federal government. Whenever I drop the term federal in this class, I'm referring to the national government, the government of all 50 states and territories. And then also the state governments. So you have this division of power between the two, and it's a constant wrestle between federal government and state government. There are certain powers that have been granted just to the federal government, certain powers that are reserved for the state governments. And I included this Venn diagram here to help you wrap your head around this concept. And it may be a little small here, but I'm going to walk you through at least some of these. So the national government of the United States has the power to declare war. The state of Illinois does not have the power to declare war on, France. It's not a power that's granted to the states. Only the national government has this power. The national government has the power to maintain armed forces. We don't have the Illinois Navy, the Illinois Army, the Illinois Marines, we just have a national military force. Now we do have individual state national guards, but that's not the same thing. That's not really what we're talking about. The national government has the ability to regulate interstate and foreign trade. The preface inter, I-N-T-E-R, means between states. Whenever you see international or interstate, it means between several. So if you have a company in Elgin is doing business with a company in Florida, and something goes wrong, well, that would be an issue that would arise in federal court, because what state's laws are going to be used? Are you going to use Illinois' laws? Well, the Florida company might object to using Illinois law in this case. Are you going to use Florida law? Well, the Elgin company is going to object to using Florida law in that case. So a dispute between interstate companies or interstate trade would go to federal or national courts. The national government admits new states. That's a power that the federal government has. So Illinois does not make the determination whether Puerto Rico ever becomes the 51st state of the United States. Rather, Congress, which is our national legislator, would make that determination. The national government established post office, sets standards, weights, and measures, coins money. We don't have Illinois bucks and Indiana dollars and Ohio coins. We have just a national currency in this country. Now let's jump over to the state powers. These are powers that are only reserved for these individual states. You have the power to establish and maintain schools. In fact, just a few years ago, you had a presidential candidate by the name of Ted Cruz ran on a campaign idea to abolish the Federal Department of Education, and his argument was that the Constitution does not grant the federal government the power to get involved with education, that education is a state-by-state issue. We have the Illinois State Board of Education in this state. We have right next door, you have the Missouri Board of Education. You'll have the Michigan State Board of Education, the Wisconsin. Every state has their own, or sets their own graduation requirements. Every state creates their own standards, and the federal government, the national government, cannot impose their will on the states. The states establish local governments. Elgin exists because Illinois allows it to exist, not necessarily the national government. Regulates business within states, so that would be intra-state commerce, INTRA state commerce. So intra means within. So this would be a company in Elgin doing business with a company in Bartlett. That's within the same state. So therefore, if these two companies had a dispute, they would not go to federal court. They would go to an Illinois state court. Make marriage laws. You saw this a few years ago where certain states allowed for gay marriage, and then you had other states around the nation had prohibited gay marriage. Ultimately, the Supreme Court of the United States, in a court case known as Obergefell versus Hodges, put its foot down and stated that the denying of homosexual couples the right to marry is a violation of the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause. So even though make marriage laws is a state power, the highest court in the land said that states that were denying same-sex couples marriage licenses were in fact violating their constitutional rights. So now across all 50 states in the nation, gay marriage is in fact legal. And then you also have shared powers. Now, shared powers are powers that are both federal and state powers. They share the power. One example is maintaining law and order, levying taxes. Some of you may already be paying taxes. If you have a job currently, and check out your pay stub, you pay not only federal taxes. For example, Social Security. You're already paying into Social Security, which is this giant pool of money that you contribute to your entire life, your entire working life. And then once you retire, you get to take out of that pool. So that's a federal program, but you also pay state taxes as well. State taxes, local taxes. You're going to have to pay property taxes that go towards funding Elgin High School. So make sure that you understand that both the national and state governments are responsible or have the ability to tax you. Borrow money, charter banks, establish courts. We'll talk about the federal and state courts, how they differ later on in this course. Moving on. The second big principle in the U.S. Constitution is the separation of powers. The separation of powers is just the literal separation of all of the power in the Constitution into three branches. Now, what students often conflate this with is the next one, which is checks and balances, which would be balancing out all of the powers to make sure that all the branches are or have an equal amount of power and can check each other's power if one branch starts to get too powerful. Don't screw these two up. When we're talking about the separation of powers, I mean just the actual separating of the powers into three branches. So you have three branches that we're going to talk about. One, the executive branch of the United States. The executive branch of the United States is the president, the vice president, and then also the cabinets, and anybody that works under the executive is considered the executive branch. Their job is to enforce law. So it's a misconception that the president makes law. The president's main job is not to make law. The president does not make law. Now, what the president can do is pass executive actions. Executive actions are temporary, though. Take President Trump. President Trump, upon taking office, he was passing a lot of executive actions that riled up many people, but President Trump was not passing too many laws through the legislative branch, through Congress. So executive actions are temporary in that they can easily just be overturned by the next president that comes into the White House. All that president needs to do is just simply write up an executive action of their own and then overturn the executive action of President Trump. But what's much more permanent than an executive action are statutes that are made by the legislative branch of Congress or of the United States. So the legislative branch creates legislation, and their job is to make law. Congress makes law. Now, once Congress makes a law, it's difficult to repeal that law because it's a long process. You have a bill arises in either the House of Representatives or the Senate at the national level, and then once it passes the House in which it originates in, it then gets bumped over to the other chamber of Congress in which it's put up for a vote, and if it passes by a majority vote in the other chamber, then it goes to the President of the United States to sign. If the President vetoes that bill, then it gets sent back to the chamber in which it originated in, and Congress can override a presidential veto if now 2/3 of both chambers pass that bill. The last branch is the judicial branch. We're going to spend a lot of time in this class talking about the court system in the United States. And the job of the judicial branch is to evaluate or interpret law. So you have laws that are up for debate. I mentioned how attorneys, what their job is they read law, and their job is to make arguments over how that law should be interpreted. So we'll get much better at doing this ourselves later on through this course. The next thing, principles in the Constitution, checks and balances. Now that we have three branches of government, now we need to make sure that they all are equal in power, that no branch of government is too powerful. And that's the principle known as checks and balances. They need to check each other's power and balance each other out. So I just gave an example of how the president can veto bills that are passed by Congress. That's an example of the president checking the power of Congress, but then Congress can check the power of the president by overriding presidential vetoes. The Congress can also check the president by impeaching the president. Now, impeachment, a lot of students believe that impeachment means the removal from office, and it doesn't mean that. Impeachment is when Congress formally charges the president with a high crime or misdemeanor. But a president can be impeached but not be removed from office. There have been 2 presidents ever that have been impeached. What 2 presidents are they? Now, I bet one that you thought of was Richard Nixon. All students, whenever I ask this, is the first thing that pops in their head is Richard Nixon. Nixon was never actually impeached. Nixon totally would have been impeached. I mean, there was plenty of evidence there to suggest that Nixon was trying to obstruct justice, but rather than face impeachment proceedings and removal from office, Nixon resigned from office. And one of the last times that Americans had seen Nixon is he gave one of these and then got onto a helicopter and just flew away. And there's the president. So Nixon was never actually impeached. Bill Clinton was impeached for the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and then you also had Andrew Johnson was impeached. Andrew Johnson was the president that had followed Abraham Lincoln. He was the president right after Abraham Lincoln. Other ways that branches can check and balance each other's power. You have Congress approves federal judges, because you have the president has the power to appoint a federal judge, but to appoint a federal judge doesn't make a judge a federal judge. If there is an opening for a federal judgeship, then the president does the equivalent of nominating somebody, but ultimately Congress is the one that approves that nominee. This happened with, this became an issue with Barack Obama in his final years of office. There was Justice Antonin Scalia had died, and so there was an opening on the court. Well, Barack Obama had appointed a judge by the name of Merrick Garland, who, by all accounts, was a good judge. This was a judge that both Democrats and Republicans had looked upon favorably. But yet you have Congress at the time, which was controlled by the Republican Party. Barack Obama was a Democrat. Congress was controlled by the Republicans, had refused to approve Merrick Garland. So Merrick Garland never got the job. The courts can declare presidential acts unconstitutional. Courts can also declare laws unconstitutional. So they're all balancing each other out, keeping each other in check. And the last few principles that we're going to talk about, one is popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is a loaded phrase, but when you're looking at it specifically on your exam, I want you to just remember that popular comes from the root word people. Popular. If you are a popular person, you are somebody that is well liked by people. And then you have sovereignty. Sovereignty has the word reign in it. So what does it mean to reign? Well, if you are a king and you reign over the people, then you rule over the people. So you have people, reign, rule by the people, power to the people. That's what that phrase means. Popular sovereignty is the backbone of a democracy, and it's what gives us our right to vote. Limited government is another principle in the Constitution, and it references the fact that the Constitution doesn't say that any branch of government can just do whatever it wants. Rather, our Constitution places limits on what each branch is allowed to do. And for example, Congress only has the powers to pass laws in areas listed in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So if I were to show that to you, and you have Article 1, Section 8, you have Congress allowed to borrow money. Congress is allowed to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among several states. That's what we were talking about earlier. Congress has the ability to coin money. Congress has the ability to establish post offices. But if it's not listed in here, then it's assumed that it is a power that is reserved for the individual states, like education. So the last thing that we're going to talk about in this lecture is the outline, the general outline of the Constitution. The Constitution begins with a brief paragraph that you might have had to memorize in middle school. I know I had to memorize it when I was in elementary school. To be honest, I have no idea why we have elementary school children memorizing the preamble to the Constitution, because this is some loaded language, and I'm not so sure that any elementary student in the entire nation knows what the word tranquility means. I always ask my students, what does the word tranquility mean? Or what does the word posterity mean? And I don't think I've ever had a student that had known what the word posterity meant. If you currently do, then I would be very impressed. So what I've done here is I've taken the outline of the text of the preamble of the Constitution, and I've translated it into just everyday English, plain English, and this, I think, will make it easier for you to wrap your head around what this paragraph is actually saying. So the actual literal text of the preamble to the Constitution reads, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish the Constitution for the United States of America." What? All right, let's read this again, but I'm going to replace several words with words that we would use in everyday language. So, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, country, establish fairness, ensure domestic peace, provide for the common military, provide for the common defense of our country, promote the general well-being of Americans, and secure the blessings of freedom for ourselves and our future generations. That's what posterity means. Do ordain and establish the Constitution for the United States of America. So what is the purpose of this paragraph? Why did the founders put this before any of the rules that are listed in the Constitution? Well, it states why the Constitution was written. It's very important. So what's not in the Constitution? Interestingly, the concept of judicial review is not in the Constitution. Judicial review is what grants the courts the ability to declare laws unconstitutional or constitutional. So this is review by the courts of the constitutionality of laws and executive orders. If a law is deemed unconstitutional, that means that this law, which has been written by a legislator, does not is incongruent or does not correspond with the principles laid out in the Constitution. So, for example, if there was a law that was passed that banned flag burning, and oftentimes you have states that try to pass laws that are like that, and the law may pass, but like I mentioned before, just because something is law does not make it a good law. So if this law that bans flag burning is challenged in court, the courts, as a result of judicial review, can say, nah, this law, this is unconstitutional because it violates the freedom of speech, the freedom of expression. And that was a court case known as Texas v. Johnson in 1985. So what happens when a section of the Constitution is no longer used? The Founding Fathers had they had great foresight in understanding that this rule book that they were creating might need to be changed in the future. Times change, people change, values change. So what happens when these values do change? What happens if you need to actually change the Constitution? What's this process like? Well, if a section of the Constitution is no longer in use or needs to be changed, then an amendment is proposed. That's what the word is, an amendment to the Constitution. An amendment to the Constitution is a change or an addition to the Constitution. And it can be proposed or ratified in one of two ways. Actually, a couple different ways, but it can be either proposed by a 2/3 vote of each House of Congress. So if 2/3 of the House of Representatives and 2/3 of the Senate both propose the amendments, then it can be ratified by either 3/4 of the state legislators. If 3/4 of the state legislators, which is the Illinois General Assembly, the Indiana General Assembly, the Maine General Assembly, the Michigan General Assembly, if 3/4, 75%, agree to change our federal Constitution, then it becomes an amendment. If not, then the amendment fails. Now, I'm only really going to talk about this route right here because the other route is, I believe, has only been used one time in all of history. Don't quote me on that, but I would have to look that up. But I believe that this route has only been used once. So back to this, amendments. What does an amendment to the Constitution look like? Well, let me show you an example. If you take Article 1 of the Constitution, you have here highlighted text. Well, the highlighted text here is not highlighted because it's just generally important. The highlighted text, and in this interactive Constitution, and you're going to see underlined text in your book. The highlighted text, if I were to click this, it says the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment provided that representation would be determined according to the whole number of persons in each state. And this is getting at the fact that this section is no longer in use because there has been an amendment that has altered this section. So this section of Article 1 used to read, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned or distributed among several states which may be included within this union, this country, according to their respective numbers, so their population, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons. So every person counts as one, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. This is what's known as the 3/5 clause, because slaves, for population counting purposes, had only counted as 3/5 of a person. Well, we don't have slavery anymore in this country because it was the 13th Amendment had abolished slavery, and then you had the 14th Amendment had stated that representation would be determined according to the whole number of everybody in the state, and that nobody counts as less than a whole person. So, all right, I think that's just about all I have for you today. Sorry I wanted a little long here. I hope you learned something. I'll see you again for our next video lecture.